Between 1980 and 1988, the city of Miami leased a refrigerator truck from Burger King for $800 a month. The reason for this was because the city's homicides were piling up at a rate faster than the city morgues could process the bodies. And so, the truck was needed to store the excess corpses. The Miami Drug Wars was a conflict between drug dealers and smugglers versus the United States government. At the same time, these dealers were competing with each other for control of the cocaine market in America, and the bodies that Miami's morgues were having difficulty processing were the results of their infighting. In 1980, the DEA estimated that 70% of the cocaine all across the 50 states of America entered the country through Miami. The drug trade in the city was estimated to be about $12 billion, making it the region's largest industry, ahead of real estate and tourism. In 1981, the number of known homicides in Miami increased to 621, up from the previous year's 573, and there was no end in sight for the law-abiding citizens. 25% of all murders were caused by machine guns, which were illegal, and 15% of the homicides were public executions, designed to convey a message to the public and other drug lords. Things were so bad that the city lost their faith in the local authorities and demanded that the federal government intervene to stop the cocaine cowboys. In 1982, after $100 million of cocaine were seized in an airport hangar, President Reagan created the South Florida Drug Task Force. He then assigned then-Vice President Bush, who was the former director of the CIA, to lead and coordinate the government's efforts to take back Miami, which was now being dubbed the drug capital of the world. Here is a detailed history of the Miami cocaine wars. But before we dive in, please take a moment to like this video, comment, and subscribe. Your support is what makes these videos possible. The Netflix show Griselda painted the famous cocaine godmother as a single mother who became a drug dealer out of necessity to support her sons after being forced to kill her abusive husband. The real-life version of the infamous woman was not as sympathetic, but it is true that she was a pioneer in creating the American market for cocaine. In 1943, Blanco was born in Colombia, 3 years before a period of political violence plagued the country for 10 years in what was a de facto civil war that affected every sector of society. Needless to say, her generation grew up traumatized and indifferent to death, a trait that gave the Colombians the edge to dominate the cocaine drug trade during the 1970s and 80s. Blanco also came from a broken home where her father was absent and her mother was an alcoholic who would regularly abuse her. As a teenager, she had enough and left home, but things did not get better. With no skills or opportunities, she became a prostitute until the early 1960s, when she married Carlos Trujillo, and the couple entered the marijuana business. Trujillo was the father of her 3 oldest sons, and in 1965, they divorced. Sometime shortly after that, it is believed that he died. In the late 60s, she illegally entered the United States and settled in the Queens borough of New York City with her children and second husband, Alberto Bravo. Both husband and wife were from Medellín, with Bravo having ties to the members who had found the drug cartel that took the city's name. By 1970, they established a thriving drug operation that sold cocaine. At first, the market growth was slow, but as word of mouth spread about this new drug, so did the demand for it. A demand that Griselda and Bravo had control over since the product came from South America. At this time, the 5 families of New York dominated crime in the city, and were also at the top of the pyramid in regard to the heroin trade in America. It's unclear of what arrangements the cocaine smugglers and the Mafia made, but Griselda was allowed to operate her business in the city, for a fee most likely. During her time in New York, Griselda Blanco pioneered what would become the model of distribution for future drug cartels. She diversified the sources of her shipments so that if one was seized by authorities, the others would make it through and the supply line would never be completely dry. She also advocated for other traffickers to work together to pool their resources and share the risks. But the good times in New York ended in 1975 after a DEA sting operation called Operation Banshee intercepted 150 kilos of her cocaine. Her and her husband were indicted that April, but before the feds could arrest them, they returned to Colombia. Blanco, who had grown up in abject poverty, now had the chance to retire in comfort and live off the millions she made in New York's drug trade. However, marriage problems that would have resulted in a divorce for most couples ended with a shootout between the husband and wife. Griselda was hit in the stomach and recovered in the hospital, while Bravo was shot in the head and died before he hit the ground. With the death of her second husband, Griselda began to have a reputation as being a black widow. But that didn't stop Colombian gangster Dario Sepulveda from getting together with her in 1978, and the couple welcomed Griselda's fourth son, named Michael Corleone, after the character in The Godfather. With her second husband and business partner, Alberto Bravo, now 6 feet underground, Griselda now had full control of her drug empire and continued to run it through Colombia. At about the same time, the Medellín Cartel solidified around the leadership of Pablo Escobar. By the late 1970s, Griselda Blanco was back in the United States and now operated out of Miami. Cocaine was trafficked and transported directly through the Colombians to Miami by using planes and ships through the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean. The market for cocaine was growing at a faster rate than when Griselda first started her business, and there were many dealers all competing for supply and territory. And when criminals have business disputes that they can't solve with words, they quickly resort to violence. Even before the explosion of cocaine's popularity, 20th century Miami had its share of crime and criminals. During the 1920s, it was a popular port for bootleggers to illegally smuggle alcohol into the country. And in the 40s and 50s, the area became popular for the Mafia, with Florida boss Santo Trafficante claiming the city as part of his territory. Florida's proximity to Cuba made it a place of interest for the mob, who owned and controlled casinos in that country before Castro's takeover in 1959. Following those events, the Mafia was expelled from Havana, and Miami became flooded with Cuban refugees who were anti-communist. The Trafficante family was based in Tampa, and by the time the 1970s arrived, they were past their peak of power. With almost 300 miles separating the two cities, they had little influence over Miami, and instead the city was taken over by Cuban gangsters. The Cubans were running Miami's underworld until Colombians began arriving in the 1970s, with the Godmother, Griselda Blanco, being the most powerful among them. Prior to the arrival of the Colombians, the Cubans had been in control of the smuggling routes through the Caribbean to Miami. During this time, marijuana was the largest import, but as the 70s reached its end, it became replaced by cocaine, which exclusively came from South America. But with the rise of the Medellín Cartel, Pablo Escobar and his leadership decided to cut out the middlemen to the American market by directly establishing their own importing routes. The Medellín Cartel was charging about $20,000 for a kilo of cocaine to the wholesale dealers in Florida. By the time that kilo was split into grams and sold on the streets, it would retail for about $250,000. The profit margins were larger than any other product a legitimate business person could get into. War for territory soon broke out across the entire city. There were conflicts between the Colombians and Cubans, along with conflicts between the Cubans and other Cubans, plus Colombians versus other Colombians. The Medellín Cartel, essentially a grand alliance between smugglers and manufacturers, became the most powerful gang in Colombia. But that was not enough for them. They wanted a monopoly on all cocaine entering the United States. Anyone buying or selling it from a different supplier was putting their lives at risk. Gangsters were killing other gangsters. One of the most high-profile early public executions from this period occurred at what was then Miami's largest shopping mall. On July 11th, 1979, at the Dayline Mall at about 2:30 in the afternoon, Herman Jimenez Paneso and his bodyguard, Juan Carlos Hernandez, were both ripped apart by machine gun fire in a liquor store. It is said that one of the men was holding a bottle of chivas when he died, and that while his body was riddled with holes, the bottle was undamaged. Both men were from Colombia, and Paneso was suspected to be a cocaine trafficker. 2 employees of the store were wounded but survived. The gunmen then retreated to the parking lot, where they shot up empty cars before jumping into a phony delivery van marked Happy Time Complete Party Supply and drove away. The van was later discovered at the other end of the mall's parking lot, and it was what police described as a war wagon. The panels were filled with concrete to be bullet resistant, while a trove of weapons and bulletproof vests were found inside. The gunmen who abandoned it most likely fled to a waiting vehicle. The sheer violence and recklessness of this hit, along with its connection to drugs, led police to dubbing the perpetrators as the Cocaine Cowboys. Fernando Villa Hernandez, a drug smuggler, was suspected of being one of the hitmen. It's said that his fingerprints were found in the abandoned van. Authorities also believe that Carlos Panelo Ramirez, another drug trafficker, was the second gunman. The theory behind these two as the shooters is that while they all worked under Griselda Blanco, there was bad blood between Ramirez and Paneso, stemming from Ramirez stealing 40 kilos of coke from the other. Ramirez then decided to hit Paneso before Paneso could hit him. While this theory does fit into the business practices that cocaine dealers had in regards to getting out of payments they did not want to make, it does not fully explain why the van was abandoned with more weapons than the 2 gunmen could possibly need. Another theory proposes that Griselda Blanco was behind the double murder, and she staged the van to be found with all the weapons to send a message to the rest of Miami's underworld that she had a lot of firepower at her disposal. In the end, we will never know the full truth behind this event, but this has been the moment where most people consider that the Miami drug wars began. Griselda Blanco reached the pinnacle of her power by around 1981, and some estimates believe that she might have been a billionaire at this point, with her largest asset being cash. Blanco and other drug dealers were known to spend their nights at the Mutiny Hotel. This luxury hotel was once a hotspot for celebrities in the 1970s, but in the 1980s, its prestige had declined, turning it into one step above a drug den. The Babylon Club in the movie Scarface was inspired by this place. But 1983 was the beginning of the end of her fall from the top. The main reason was marriage problems between her and Dario. It's suspected that Dario did not want their shared son, Michael Corleone, to be growing up in the drug lord world that Griselda was part of. But they were having other problems too, which caused them to separate. One day, when Dario had custody of their son, he essentially kidnapped him by taking him back to Colombia, where he figured they could lay low. And he was wrong. One day, he was stopped by the police with his son in the car. Dario was executed in front of the child, and the boy was returned to his mother. Many members of the Medellín Cartel are said to have been upset by the Black Widow's move to kill her third husband, and this included Pablo Escobar and the Ochoa brothers. This animosity with her suppliers who could back her rivals, plus increased law enforcement, led to her fleeing to California to avoid arrest and murder. Around this time, she befriended Marta Ochoa, sister of the Ochoa brothers, in the hope that this connection could provide her with cocaine in California so she could continue with her empire. She was fronted with 1,500 kilos and then is said to have murdered Marta rather than pay her back. This move would turn her into a full-blown enemy of the Medellín Cartel. But before they could kill her, she was arrested and thrown into a federal prison for decades for her drug dealing. Instead, the Ochoas needed to settle for murdering her 3 oldest sons in the years that followed. Griselda would be indicted for 3 counts of first-degree murder in Florida, which was sure to be a slam dunk for the prosecution, as her second-in-command, Jorge Rivi Ayala, was going to testify against her. But the case fell apart after it was revealed Rivi was having phone sex while in prison with a secretary from the DA's office. In 2004, with Griselda's health failing, the government granted her a compassionate release from prison, and she was deported to Colombia, where she lived in obscurity until 2012, when an assassin shot her with a machine gun in a butcher shop, and then sped away on a motorcycle. It is a fate that many of the 200 people she is believed to have been responsible for ordering the murders of suffered. Drug traffickers and dealers were not the only victims entering Miami's overburdened morgue. Drug mules who smuggled cocaine in the United States from Colombia by swallowing small plastic bags containing the drugs were dying at alarming numbers. What would happen is that the plastic would sometimes dissolve due to the acid in the person's stomach, allowing the cocaine to directly enter the person's body and kill them with an overdose. It became common for cheap motels to find these victims dead in their rooms. Police on the scene were usually able to easily piece together what happened, since most of the victims died with laxatives on their nightstands. Another type of victim during this period was potential witnesses. Law enforcement was largely caught off guard by the sudden popularity of cocaine, and they had to play catch-up in order to restore order. The goal was to send drug dealers to prison so that the financial rewards of selling coke would be dwarfed by the risks. Cases were made against dealers, and many were built on the testimony of witnesses. But going on the record against these people was a dangerous place to be in, because they knew that if witnesses were gone, so would the case against them. This strategy was used by Cuban kingpins Sal Magluta and Willie Falcon. Sal Magluta and Willie Falcon came to the United States as children when their parents fled from Castro. Both were childhood friends that sold pot together and eventually either dropped out or were expelled from high school. They were the type of guys who the teachers said would never amount to anything. Instead, they formed what would be known as the Los Muchachos crime syndicate, and they became filthy rich. Magluta was the brains and Falcon was the muscle. In 1979, Magluta was caught on a wiretap, which led to him and Falcon being noticed by law enforcement. They were arrested and charged with drug trafficking. They were each given a sentence of 5 years probation. Instead of treating this moment as a life-changing close call, they chose to ignore it. The two young and ambitious marijuana dealers became introduced to Jorge Valdez, a fellow Cuban who came to America as a youth and was now making a fortune in bringing cocaine into Miami for the Medellín Cartel using boats. The two began to sell coke for him, and the money really started to roll in. In 1980, Valdez was arrested and given a 20-year sentence for trafficking. While out on bail, he turned over operations to Magluta and Falcon. The two expanded their retail business and reinvested the profits in their real estate. They created construction companies and made their fathers the company presidents. They were also known for their generosity, giving away money to people in need while also making donations to local causes, such as sponsoring the basketball team of the school that expelled them. All this goodwill also had its dividends, as nobody was willing to give the cops any information about their activities. Throwing around money to the community was not the only thing that set them apart from the high-profile Griselda Blanco. Los Muchachos also had a reputation as being nonviolent drug dealers, which made them a low priority for law enforcement. While it's very unlikely that they were truly nonviolent, they most likely hid their dead bodies rather than shoot them with machine guns in crowded public places. But their luck would not last forever, and after Griselda packed up for the West Coast, the two men were arrested in 1984 for drug trafficking. But they used fake names and IDs during the time before computers, which allowed them to be granted bail and then disappeared to California, where they would continue to run their operations. But the law enforcement heat there got too hot, and they returned to Miami, where they continued to use fake IDs and names. The two men had a passion for powerboat racing that might have been an extension of their smuggling business. There was a popular image in the 80s of fast speedboats full of cocaine, evading the larger and slower Coast Guard ships trying to stop them. Magluta and Falcon became professional powerboat racers and were featured on ESPN in 1987, where they were promptly recognized by a California sheriff who had been looking for them. In 1988, Magluta and Falcon were now well known and wanted by law enforcement. On March 30th, on a chance encounter, police found Magluta in a stationery store purchasing office supplies. When confronted, he produced a fake ID, but a detective whom he went to high school with positively identified him and he was arrested. On March 4th, a corrupt prison official altered Magluta's paperwork to say he had served 14 months in county and was eligible for release. He walked out the door and rented a luxury apartment for $5,800 a month, which today is almost $16,000. Meanwhile, Falcon holed up in a mansion and avoided going out in public, while Magluta acted like nothing was wrong and didn't make any attempt to hide. He enjoyed the cat and mouse game he was playing with law enforcement. The following year, a grand jury began to investigate their lawyer, Juan Acosta. On September 18th, 1989, Acosta was assassinated by Colombian hitmen so that his secrets would die with him. This pattern would continue into the 90s and should dispel any notion that Los Muchachos were the only non-violent drug dealers in Miami. When 1990 came, the government increased their efforts against the cartels during the Miami drug wars. In 1991, Pedro Rosello, Falcon's brother-in-law and one of the organization's top lieutenants, was arrested and agreed to inform on his bosses. By the end of the year, Magluto and Falcon were arrested again. While they were in prison, they continued to run their operations, as well as have a great time. They hired the best lawyers money could buy, and had their associates register as private detectives so that they could freely visit them. They would also have mistresses and girlfriends register as paralegals, so they could have conjugal visits, while bribed guards looked the other way. In August of 1992, Falcon's wife Alina was murdered outside of her car in broad daylight. It was suspected to be drug-related, but it ended up being a robbery gone wrong. Falcon became depressed after this, but he never lost his loyalty to Magluta and refused to betray his partner, despite having multiple offers from the government for leniency. The duo tried to bribe multiple judges in an effort to get their cases dismissed before trial, but they had no luck in making that work. Their lawyers also publicized the names of witnesses who would be testifying against the two, with the explanation that they wanted more information about these people. However, several of these witnesses would meet untimely violent deaths, which had been blamed on the attorneys purposefully trying to put these people in danger. In 1996, they had their day in court, and the jury found them not guilty of every single charge that was brought against them. But they were not free men. Falcon was kept behind bars on an earlier drug charge, while Magluta put up $400,000 for bail and agreed to wear an ankle bracelet. But Magluta's confidence was high after beating the government in court. He ignored his bail conditions and went to nightclubs while continuing to run his empire. At the same time, the government believed that the jury might have been tainted at the original trial, and they launched an investigation called Operation Recoil. They soon observed that jury foreman Miguel Moya was living a very lavish lifestyle for an airplane mechanic making $36,000 a year. When Moya learned that he was on the FBI's radar, he went to Magluta and demanded more money for his now increased risk. This did not go well with Magluta, and the FBI, knowing about the meeting, sent an undercover agent to pose as Magluta's henchman to intimidate him. They got Moya to admit to jury tampering, and he was promptly arrested. Moya had his day in court in 1998, which resulted in a mistrial. The following year, he was found guilty of accepting almost $500,000 in bribes and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Other jurors were also found to have been bribed, and they met the same fate as their foreman. In 1999, Magluta's girlfriend, Marilyn Bonaccia, was pulled over by police while she had his ledger in the car with her. Marilyn turned against her boyfriend, claiming that she was disgusted by how he ruined the lives of two young mothers on the jury by bribing them. Magluda's lawyers argued that she was bitter because he had cut her off from her allowance because of her overspending. That summer, Magluda was retried. Maryland claimed that Magluda had set up his former lawyer, Juan Acosta's murder in 1989, but the defense lawyers claimed she was making it up and that all of her knowledge came from newspaper articles at the time. At the end of the day, Magluda was found not guilty of jury tampering and the obstruction of justice through having witnesses killed. But he was found guilty of multiple counts of money laundering, for which he received the maximum sentence of 205 years in prison. Later was appealed and reduced to 195 years instead. Willie Falcon, seeing how his partner's trial played out, decided to take a plea deal and received a sentence of 14 years. In 2017, Falcon was released from prison and deported to the Dominican Republic. Today, his whereabouts are unknown. The only reason why drug lords like Griselda Blanco and Los Muchachos were able to make billions of dollars was because thousands of Americans were more than happy to buy their products, despite its illegal status and health risks. Meanwhile, American smugglers like Mickey Monday and Barry Seal were happy to work with the Medellín Cartel to get their products into the United States from locations in the Caribbean. At the same time, the government and law enforcement were taken by surprise with the explosion of cocaine into the drug market. The DEA was created before cocaine became a large problem, but the drugs they were fighting against in the 1970s were heroin, acid, and marijuana. By 1979, the homicide rate in Miami exploded, and the violence began to overwhelm the local police. Many experienced cops became disheartened by the homicides that seemed to have no end in sight and retired, while others, who saw that the U.S. was losing the war on drugs, decided to stop seriously fighting. It became a running joke that when the police found and celebrated seizing 200 kilos, another 2,000 were entering the city right under their nose. In 1981 and 1982, the Miami Police Department went on a hiring frenzy and brought more than 700 additional cops into their forces. Unfortunately, to meet this quota, they had to lower their standards, which opened the door to corruption. In 1987, 100 of the department's 1,060 officers were under investigation for misconduct. Despite all of this, the Miami River Cop scandal still managed to shock the city and nation. In 1984, a group of 20 police officers began stealing cocaine and cash from suspected drug dealers and users. It started with evidence becoming lighter than when it was found on the scene, but soon it gradually built up to where the cops were practically robbing small-time drug dealers. Some of the stolen cocaine would go towards personal use, while the rest would be sold, meaning that these officers robbed drug dealers to become drug dealers. In July of 1985, the cops raided a boat called the Mary C. while it was docked at the Jones Boatyard on the Miami River as it was being unloaded of 400 kilos of cocaine. 3 of the 7 people unloading the boat jumped into the river to avoid arrest, despite not knowing how to swim, and they drowned, which triggered an investigation. The scandal broke wide open after a couple of the officers tried selling some of the seized coke to undercover agents. 7 officers were put on trial, but a jury could not agree on their guilt, which resulted in a mistrial in September of 1986. 20 officers, including the original 7, were indicted, and a new trial commenced. 1 officer took a deal to become a witness against the others. In February of 1988, the remaining 19 were found guilty of various state and federal crimes that included murder, racketeering, robbery, drug possession, civil rights violations, and conspiracy charges. Each one received an average sentence of 23 years. With the Miami Police Department overwhelmed, the federal government stepped in with the South Florida Task Force, which coordinated multiple federal agencies under the supervision of Vice President Bush. Resources poured into the area to stop the smuggling, and seizures of cocaine increased dramatically. But the Medellín Cartel viewed these raids as acceptable losses, and in response, they dramatically increased the cocaine that was being shipped. So much coke was being attempted to enter America that the government was simply overwhelmed. In the end, 3 actions from the United States government would lead to the end of the Miami drug wars. The Coast Guard and Navy were deployed into the Caribbean to stop smugglers using boats and planes. Meanwhile, the DEA's Operation Swordfish went after the money that was being laundered by the dealers. And finally, the governments of the United States and Colombia declared war on the Medellín Cartel, which eventually, after a few hard years of attrition, ended with its collapse and the death of Pablo Escobar. The Caribbean path for drugs to flow into Miami was shut down, and the criminal organizations that used them were dismantled. But one key strategic failure for the United States government was that they did not make a dent in the demand for cocaine by its citizens. In 1989, the city of Miami was able to return the refrigerator truck back to Burger King because its homicides had decreased and the city began to feel safe again. But illegal drug use among Americans across all 50 states was growing. Other Colombians and South Americans saw the profits the Medellín Cartel was making, and with that organization taken off the board, new cocaine suppliers filled the void. And with the sea route effectively closed, they turned to the Mexican drug cartels to smuggle their goods across the entire 2,000-mile border. Before 1990, the entry of cocaine into America was mostly centralized in Miami, and all of the crime that was associated with it was brought upon that city. At the end of the Miami drug wars, that cocaine trafficking spread across the southern border, and its violence also became diffused. The scale of the smuggling is near impossible to stomp out, and as the Colombian cartels have declined in power, the Mexican ones have replaced them. However, since the year 2000, cocaine use among Americans has declined, and after 2020, that decline has accelerated. The decline coincides with the rise of the opioid crisis, but there is another reason to believe that drug use as a whole is receding as well. Some of this decline in the market demand for cocaine and other illegal drugs could be credited to fentanyl. Cocaine was attractive to drug smugglers from South America because it was smaller and more profitable than marijuana. Fentanyl was attractive to the cartels for the same reasons. Because it's highly potent and toxic, it's smaller than cocaine and heroin with its size and weight and could be sold for much more money. As a result, it's common for dealers to cut their drugs with fentanyl so that they could stretch their supplies and profits. But the deadly nature of fentanyl has led to many people trying to avoid it. And because they cannot buy drugs like cocaine without knowing if it's been tainted, people are now shunning them altogether. The greed of the drug suppliers may have been the most effective dent against the American demand for their product.